In the summer of 1943, the air war over the Pacific had become a brutal contest of adaptation. Thousands of miles from Washington and Tokyo, above jungles, coral reefs, and open ocean, survival depended not only on courage, but on physics. American pilots flying the twin-engine Lockheed P-38 Lightning believed they had one of the most advanced fighters in the world. It was fast, heavily armed, and capable of high-altitude interception. On paper, it outclassed most of its opponents. But in the swirling chaos of close-range combat, paper advantages evaporated. Their most dangerous adversary was the Mitsubishi A6M Zero. Lightweight, incredibly maneuverable, and built for tight-turning engagements, the Zero had already proven itself deadly from Pearl Harbor to Guadalcanal. Japanese pilots were trained to exploit its strengths: low-speed agility, rapid roll response, and the ability to outturn heavier American aircraft in horizontal fights. In a classic dogfight, where two fighters spiral and circle in tightening arcs, the Zero could pivot inside the American turn, line up its guns, and fire first. The P-38 had been designed with a different philosophy. It was an energy fighter. With its twin Allison engines and turbo superchargers, it excelled at speed, climb rate, and diving attacks. American doctrine emphasized boom and zoom tactics: dive through the enemy formation, fire a burst, then climb back to altitude before the enemy could respond. In theory, a P-38 pilot should never allow himself to be drawn into a slow, turning fight with a Zero. Speed was life. Altitude was insurance. But war rarely follows doctrine. Over New Guinea and the Solomon Islands, combat often collapsed into close-range turning engagements. Weather, visibility, surprise attacks, or simple human instinct pulled pilots into the kind of fight the Zero wanted. And that was where something didn't feel right. P-38 pilots reported a frustrating sensation during hard turns. They would pull back on the control stick, expecting the aircraft to respond instantly. Instead, there was a subtle hesitation, not dramatic, not catastrophic, just enough to matter. In a dogfight, milliseconds define survival. A fraction of a second can decide who gets behind whom. Officially, nothing was wrong. Maintenance crews checked control cable tension regularly. The measurements fell within factory specifications. The Army Air Force's technical manuals allowed for minor slack in the control cables, necessary, engineers said, to account for temperature changes, vibration, and structural flexing. The numbers were precise, acceptable tolerance, within limits. But combat doesn't care about acceptable tolerance. The P-38's control system relied on long runs of steel cable connecting the cockpit controls to the elevators and ailerons. These cables stretched through the fuselage booms and wing center section. Over time, with heat, humidity, and stress, small amounts of slack developed. Even 3/8 of an inch of play at the stick could translate into a measurable delay at the control surfaces. To an engineer on a drafting table, 3/8 of an inch was negligible. To a pilot pulling 6 Gs with a Zero tightening behind him, it could feel like eternity. Imagine two fighters entering a horizontal turn at the same speed. The one that achieves maximum lift and bank angle first gains the advantage. The physics is unforgiving. Turn performance depends on lift overcoming weight while centripetal force pulls the aircraft through its arc. The tighter the turn radius, the faster a pilot can bring guns to bear. If one aircraft begins its turn a fraction of a second later, its turn circle widens. The opponent slides inside. Pilots began noticing patterns. In debriefings, they described Zeros that seemed to snap into turns faster. American aircraft felt slightly sluggish at the initial control input. Some blamed training, others blamed tactics, a few blamed themselves. Yet the P-38 was not inherently incapable of maneuvering. Test data showed it could compete respectably at certain speeds.
Something else was happening in real combat conditions. The aircraft responded, just not instantly. In high-speed dives, the Lightning performed beautifully. Its concentrated nose armament, 4.50 caliber machine guns and a 20mm cannon allowed accurate fire without convergence issues. Many successful American aces used disciplined hit-and-run tactics to great effect. But when surprised at lower altitude, when forced into defensive turns, the Lightning's edge dulled. Some pilots survived by rigidly refusing to turn with Zeros. Others were not so fortunate. Combat loss reports from 1942 and early 1943 reflected a painful reality. When caught in turning engagements, American fighters often paid the price. The irony was that maintenance logs showed no glaring mechanical failures. Inspections were clean. Control systems met specification. Engineering officers saw no crisis. From a bureaucratic standpoint, the aircraft functioned exactly as designed. But war compresses margins. What is acceptable in testing may be fatal in combat. The Pacific theater amplified every weakness. Tropical heat expanded metal. Humidity affected tension. Rough airstrips and constant vibration stressed components beyond ideal laboratory assumptions. Gradually, a quiet suspicion spread among experienced crew chiefs and pilots. The delay wasn't imagination. It wasn't cowardice. It wasn't poor flying. It was mechanical. In debriefings, pilots began comparing notes. "Does your stick feel loose at center?" one would ask. "Just a little play before she bites?" another would reply. The conversations were informal, cautious. No one wanted to accuse the aircraft or the engineers back home of a flaw without proof. Yet the evidence was accumulating in the most unforgiving way possible, in aerial combat outcomes. The difference between doctrine and reality had become deadly clear. The P-38 had been built to dominate through speed and altitude, but Pacific combat demanded instantaneous control response. Even the smallest lag could widen a turn circle by precious yards. Even a slight delay could let a Zero slip inside and pull the trigger first. By mid-1943, on remote airfields carved from jungle mud, a handful of mechanics began looking more closely at control cable tension. They ran their hands along the lines. They felt the minute give in the system. Within the regulated limits, yes, but perhaps not within the limits of survival. For the pilots climbing into their cockpits each morning, strapping in beneath the twin booms and distinctive central nacelle, the question lingered unspoken. Was it tactics? Was it skill? Or was the machine itself holding them back by the smallest measurable amount? In war, victory sometimes turns on grand strategy, and sometimes it turns on fractions of an inch. As more dogfights ended with the same unsettling pattern, Zeros turning just a little tighter, responding just a little faster, the suspicion hardened into conviction. Somewhere between the cockpit stick and the control surface, something was stealing time. And in aerial combat, time is life.
By August 1943, the airstrip at Dabadura in New Guinea was little more than a scar carved out of jungle and mud. The humidity hung thick in the air. Engines coughed dust and heat. Mechanics worked shirtless under the sun, their hands black with oil, their boots sinking into soft ground. This was not a laboratory. It was not a factory floor in California. It was the edge of the war. The 5th Air Force had been flying constant missions against Japanese positions along the northern coast of New Guinea. The P-38 Lightnings came back from sorties streaked with oil and cordite residue, sometimes missing panels, sometimes missing friends. In the debriefing tents, pilots repeated the same story heard across the theater. The Zero could turn inside them. The Lightning felt just slightly behind the moment. Technical Sergeant James McKetta had heard those stories. As a crew chief, he listened more than he spoke. Mechanics lived in the shadow of pilots' lives. When something went wrong in the air, it began on the ground. McKenna was responsible for keeping his assigned P-38 combat ready. That meant inspecting engines, hydraulics, control linkages, everything between cockpit and sky. Control cables were part of his routine inspection. The P-38's flight controls were not powered by hydraulics like later jets. They relied on physical linkages, steel cables routed through pulleys and fairleads, connecting the pilot's stick and rudder pedals directly to the control surfaces. When a pilot pulled back on the stick, tension traveled through cable runs to move the elevators. When he banked, cables deflected the ailerons. It was simple, direct, mechanical. But simple systems still obey physics. Steel expands when heated. It contracts when cooled. In New Guinea's tropical climate, temperatures could swing dramatically between early morning and midday. Add vibration from twin engines, the flexing of aluminum structure under G-forces, and the constant stress of combat maneuvers, and those long cable runs began to develop small amounts of slack. According to technical orders, a specific amount of play was permitted. Engineers back in the United States had built tolerances into the system deliberately. Cables pulled too tight could bind or snap under stress. A slight looseness was considered safe. It allowed for thermal expansion and structural movement. McKenna began wondering whether safe and optimal were the same thing. He performed a tactile check on one of the Lightnings preparing for a mission. With the aircraft parked and powered down, he gently moved the stick. There it was, a subtle free play before resistance engaged, just a fraction of movement, within limits, but noticeable. 3/8 of an inch at the stick did not sound dramatic, yet control systems involve leverage. The stick's small motion translates through pulleys into deflection at the control surface. Even a minor delay between input and response can affect how quickly aerodynamic forces build. In a turning fight, lift must increase immediately to tighten the arc. Lift itself is governed by airspeed, air density, wing area, and the coefficient of lift. In simplified aerodynamic terms, lift can be expressed as proportional to velocity squared and angle of attack. When a pilot pulls back on the stick, he increases the angle of attack, raising the coefficient of lift. But if there's a delay, if the control surface deflection lags behind the pilot's hand, the aircraft does not instantly achieve the higher lift needed for a tighter turn. In a dogfight measured in seconds, that delay widens the turn radius. McKenna was not an aeronautical engineer. He did not speak in equations, but he understood machinery. He understood tension. He knew that slack meant lost motion. In automotive systems, in artillery linkages, in any mechanical device, play in the system meant energy wasted before useful work began. He also knew the chain of command. Field modifications to aircraft were not taken lightly. The Army Air Forces maintained strict control over engineering changes. Unauthorized alterations could ground a squadron, or worse, lead to disciplinary action. Mechanics were expected to maintain, not redesign. Yet the pattern was nagging. Pilots were not complaining about engine failures. They were not reporting structural weakness. They were describing something subtler. The airplane did not respond as sharply as they expected at the very start of a maneuver. McKenna began paying closer attention after missions. When aircraft returned, he would ask careful questions. "How did she feel today?" he'd say, casually. Some pilots shrugged. Others hesitated before answering. "She's fine, just wish she'd bite a little faster in the turn." Bite. That word stuck with him. He inspected pulleys and cable tensioning points more thoroughly. The system relied on turnbuckles to adjust cable tightness. These were set during maintenance according to specification charts. The numbers were precise. No one had questioned them. But specifications were written under controlled conditions. Combat was uncontrolled by definition. On the morning of August 18, 1943, as another mission was being prepared, McKenna again checked the control system of a P-38 scheduled to fly escort. He moved the stick gently, felt the play.
Imagined a Zero closing in from high 6 o'clock. Imagined a pilot pulling hard, needing instantaneous response. He realized something simple but unsettling. The aircraft was not broken, it was built with margin. But in war, margin becomes vulnerability. The engineering officers had followed doctrine. The pilots had followed doctrine. The aircraft itself had followed doctrine. Fight with speed, not in circles. Yet reality was forcing Lightning pilots into circles. McKenna faced a quiet dilemma: respect the manual or trust his instincts. There were no alarms, no dramatic failures, just that small, measurable slack, acceptable tolerance, within limits. But what if those limits were written for peacetime durability, not survival against a Zero that could pivot like a dancer in the sky? As engines began starting on the flight line and propellers blurred into silver discs, the suspicion hardened into conviction. The problem was not imagination, it was mechanical delay hiding inside official specifications. Somewhere between the pilot's hand and the control surface, time was being lost. And in aerial combat, lost time becomes lost lives.
By the time the next mission briefing ended on August 17, 1943, the suspicion had turned into resolve. Technical Sergeant James McKenna stood beside the P-38 assigned to Lieutenant Hayes and made a decision that did not exist in any manual. He was not redesigning the airplane. He was not replacing a factory component. He was simply refusing to accept that within tolerance was good enough. The problem was slack. Slack meant lost motion. Lost motion meant delayed control surface deflection. And delayed deflection meant a wider turn circle at the exact moment a pilot needed the opposite. Control cables were tensioned with turnbuckles, but they were set conservatively. Tighten them too much and they could bind when the airframe flexed under G-load. Tighten them too little and free play developed. McKenna believed the system needed something else, something that would eliminate the initial dead space without overstressing the cable. What he found was ordinary piano wire. Piano wire was high-tensile steel, strong, resilient, capable of holding shape under load. It was available in maintenance supplies for various small tasks. McKenna cut a 6-inch section and bent it carefully into a Z shape. The idea was simple: install it as a supplemental tensioner within the control run, preloading the system just enough to remove slack while still allowing necessary flex. It was not in the manual. He worked quickly but precisely. The modification did not replace existing components. It subtly changed how tension was distributed at rest. When the control stick was centered, the wire held the cable snug. When the pilot applied force, there would be no initial lag before the control surface began to move. Mechanically, the concept relied on preload force. In physics, force in a stretched cable relates to stiffness and displacement. Increase the initial displacement slightly, add preload, and you eliminate the dead zone where movement occurs without useful output. McKenna did not write it as an equation, he felt it in his hands. When he moved the stick now, resistance was immediate, the slack was gone. The risk was real. Unauthorized modifications to combat aircraft could lead to grounding, reprimand, even court-martial. If the cable snapped in flight because of excess tension, the consequences would be catastrophic. Elevator failure at combat speed meant loss of control. There would be no second chance. Lieutenant Hayes approached his aircraft unaware of the quiet gamble that had just taken place. McKenna did not give a dramatic speech. He simply said, "She might feel a little tighter today." Hayes nodded, accustomed to small maintenance adjustments. The engines roared to life, twin propellers blurred into synchronized discs. The P-38 taxied down the rough Dobodura strip and lifted into the humid sky. For the first several minutes, nothing unusual happened. Climb to altitude, form up, scan the horizon. Then the radio crackled. Enemy aircraft inbound. Zeros. The engagement unfolded fast.
Hayes spotted a Zero attempting to climb above him for a diving attack. He rolled and pulled into a hard turn, instinctively bracing for the familiar softness at the stick. It never came. The aircraft responded instantly. The moment his hand moved, the elevators bit into the air. Lift built without hesitation. The Lightning carved into its turn with a sharpness he had not felt before. The Zero tried to tighten inside him, but the gap did not widen this time. Turn performance is governed not only by lift, but centripetal acceleration. In simplified terms, the tighter the radius, the greater the required inward force. For a given speed, reducing the turn radius demands immediate and precise input. If there's delay, the radius increases. With the slack removed, Hayes achieved peak deflection faster. His turn tightened sooner. In less than a minute, the geometry of the fight shifted. Instead of chasing the Zero's tail, he began sliding towards it. The Lightning's concentrated nose guns required no convergence adjustment. When the Zero filled his windscreen, he fired. The first enemy aircraft erupted in smoke and flame. The fight was not over. 2 more Zeros pressed in. Hayes climbed, rolled, and again snapped into a defensive turn. Each time, the aircraft responded without hesitation. What had once felt like a slight rubber band effect between hand and horizon was gone. The machine felt connected, immediate, predictable. Within 7 minutes, 3 Zeros were falling toward the jungle. Back at Dobodura, mechanics scanned the sky anxiously as returning aircraft appeared one by one. Hayes landed, taxied in, and shut down. He climbed from the cockpit with a look that McKenna would remember for the rest of his life. "She's different. What did you do?" There was no boast in McKenna's reply, just a quiet explanation, a piece of wire, a little more tension. Word spread fast among pilots, not rumors of magic, but of responsiveness. The Lightning could still not outturn a Zero in a sustained low-speed spiral. Physics had not changed. The aircraft was heavier. Wing loading remained higher. But the initial delay, the hesitation that cost position in the first critical seconds, had vanished. That distinction mattered. Dogfights are often decided in transitions, the first break, the first reversal, the first defensive pull. If an aircraft responds instantly, the pilot can exploit energy advantages more effectively. Speed tactics work better when control response is precise. By the end of the day, other crew chiefs were asking questions. Could they try the same adjustment? Was it safe? Would engineering officers approve? Approval had not yet come. Officially, nothing had changed. But in the sky above New Guinea, something had. A 6-inch piece of piano wire had erased 3/8 of an inch of slack, and in doing so, it had erased a fraction of a second between decision and action. In aerial combat, that fraction can mean everything.
The victory did not stay quiet for long. In war, success travels faster than paperwork. By the end of that week at Dobodura, pilots were talking, not about miracles, not about impossible performance, but about something more believable and more dangerous: control response. Lieutenant Hayes's report was careful. He did not claim the P-38 could suddenly outturn a Zero in a sustained low-speed spiral. That would have contradicted aerodynamic reality. The Zero was lighter, with lower wing loading and extraordinary low-speed handling. But Hayes described something else. The Lightning now responded the instant he moved the stick. The hesitation was gone. The airplane felt tight. Other pilots wanted the same feeling. Crew chiefs began visiting McKenna informally. They inspected the modification, a short length of piano wire, bent precisely, installed to preload the cable system. It was simple enough that any skilled mechanic could replicate it. It required no new parts from supply, no official approval, just nerve. Within days, a second P-38 carried the modification, then a third. The spread did not follow formal channels. It moved along the same network that had always sustained frontline aviation: mechanic to mechanic, squadron to squadron, conversation over engine noise and ration coffee.
No written orders, no memos stamped approved, just a shared understanding that something was working. The key was restraint. The modification was not about over-tightening cables to the point of failure. Too much tension would increase stress loads under high G maneuvers. When an aircraft pulls into a turn, the aerodynamic load factor rises. That load factor can be simplified as the ratio of lift to weight. At higher load factors, control surfaces experience greater forces. If cables were pulled excessively tight, those forces could transfer directly into components not designed for constant strain. The genius of the field fix was that it removed slack without pushing the system beyond safe limits. It erased delay without eliminating flexibility. By September 1943, dozens of P-38s in the theater had received the quiet adjustment. Pilots noticed the difference immediately. The airplane did not magically break physics. It still demanded disciplined energy tactics, but the first seconds of a defensive break or aggressive snap turn now belonged to the Lightning pilot, not automatically to the Zero. Combat reports began to shift in tone. Engagements that previously ended with American pilots struggling to stay alive now described controlled reversals, sharper brake turns, more successful gun solutions. The kill ratios did not transform overnight, but they moved toward parity. Zeros still claimed victories. Japanese pilots were skilled, aggressive, and experienced, but the edge they once exploited, the Lightning's slight delay at initial control input, had narrowed. Engineering officers eventually noticed something unusual. Aircraft coming in for inspection showed slightly different cable tension characteristics. Questions were asked. Some squadron commanders looked the other way. Results spoke louder than regulations. There was resistance, of course. Official doctrine warned against unauthorized field modifications. Aircraft were complex systems. One small change could cascade into unforeseen consequences. Headquarters valued standardization for good reason. In a global war, consistency saved lives. Yet the Pacific was far from headquarters. Dabadura was not a test facility. It was a battlefield. The unofficial modification represented something larger than a piece of wire. It revealed a tension between centralized engineering and decentralized experience. The factory built the machine for a theoretical envelope of performance. The battlefield revealed where that envelope was insufficient. Eventually, reports filtered back through formal channels. Maintenance officers documented the improved control feel. Pilots described sharper response during combat maneuvering. Engineers began re-evaluating allowable slack in control systems, especially under tropical operating conditions. When later production variants of the P-38, including the improved models introduced in 1944, featured refinements to control harmony and responsiveness, the influence of field experience was unmistakable. The factory did not advertise a piano wire fix, but lessons learned in mud-soaked Pacific airstrips found their way into engineering updates. The spread of the modification also changed something intangible: morale. Pilots who once felt at the mercy of a slightly sluggish response now trusted their aircraft more deeply. Confidence in combat is not abstract. It comes from knowing that when you move the stick, the machine obeys without delay. That trust allows decisive action instead of hesitation, and hesitation in aerial combat can be fatal. By late 1943, the Lightning's reputation in the Pacific had stabilized. It was no longer viewed merely as a fast but awkward heavyweight. In the hands of disciplined pilots with sharper control response, it became a formidable energy fighter capable of surviving and winning against the Zero. The change had not required a new engine, not a redesigned wing, not a revolutionary weapon, just 6 inches of wire. It began as a quiet act of defiance against acceptable tolerance. It became an underground innovation adopted across squadrons, and before the war was over, it influenced how engineers thought about control systems under combat stress. because sometimes the difference between defeat and survival is not found in grand strategy. It is found in the elimination of a fraction of slack between intention and action.
By the end of 1943, the Pacific Air War had entered a new phase. The Allies were advancing. Air superiority was no longer a desperate hope. It was becoming a measurable objective. The P-38 Lightning, once criticized for struggling in turning engagements, had matured into one of the most effective long-range fighters in the theater. But its evolution did not come solely from factories in California. It came from mud, sweat, and 6 inches of steel wire on a remote airstrip. What began as an unauthorized field adjustment slowly transformed into something larger, a lesson in how combat exposes the difference between theoretical design and operational reality. Aircraft engineering is always a balance between competing forces. Controls must be light enough for precision, yet strong enough to survive high loads. Structures must flex without failing. Systems must tolerate temperature changes, vibration, and fatigue. Designers calculate safety margins carefully, but war compresses those margins. It pushes machines to the edge of their performance envelopes repeatedly, sometimes daily. The piano wire modification did not change the P-38's fundamental aerodynamics. It did not reduce its wing loading. It did not alter the relationship between lift and weight. In a sustained, low-speed horizontal turn, the Zero could still hold advantages because its design favored minimal mass and maximum maneuverability at slower speeds. But the Lightning's advantage lay elsewhere, in energy retention, dive acceleration, and firepower concentration. Those strengths could only be exploited fully if the pilot trusted his controls completely. The removal of initial slack restored that trust. In aviation, control systems are about feedback loops. A pilot observes attitude and horizon, makes an input, senses resistance through the stick, and adjusts. If there's delay in that loop, the pilot compensates subconsciously, often overcorrecting or hesitating. When the loop becomes immediate, control becomes intuitive. The relationship between applied force and aircraft response can be viewed through basic mechanics. Acceleration results from force divided by mass. A equals F divided by m. The pilot supplies force through control surfaces. The aircraft's mass determines how quickly its motion changes. While mass could not be altered in the field, the immediacy of applied force could be. Eliminating slack meant force was transmitted instantly, not after a brief loss of motion. As the war progressed into 1944 and 1945, improvements in control harmony and responsiveness became priorities across multiple aircraft programs. Engineers increasingly recognized that pilot perception mattered as much as raw aerodynamic numbers. A fighter that felt responsive was often flown more aggressively and more effectively. Later production variants of the Lightning incorporated refinements informed by operational experience. Tighter control tolerances, improved boost systems, and adjustments to handling characteristics reflected lessons learned under fire. The piano wire itself may not have been installed at the factory, but the principle behind it, minimize delay, maximize responsiveness, had been validated. The influence extended beyond one aircraft. In the Korean War and later during the jet age, designers emphasized powered flight controls, hydraulic boost systems, and eventually fly-by-wire technology. Each advancement aimed at the same fundamental goal: reduce the gap between pilot intention and aircraft reaction. That gap, however small, defines the difference between control and vulnerability. Estimating the number of lives affected by the field modification is difficult.
Combat statistics are shaped by countless variables: training, weather, tactics, luck. But squadron records suggest that improved responsiveness contributed to more successful defensive breaks and more effective offensive positioning. Even a handful of avoided shootdowns represented dozens of airmen returning home instead of being lost over jungle or sea. Perhaps the most important legacy was cultural rather than mechanical. The episode demonstrated that innovation in war does not flow in a single direction from top to bottom. It can rise from the lowest ranks. A technical sergeant, armed not with authority but with observation, recognized a flaw hidden inside acceptable tolerance. He did not possess advanced degrees or access to wind tunnels. He possessed experience, intuition, and the willingness to challenge assumptions. In large military organizations, regulations exist for good reason. Standardization prevents chaos, yet adaptability wins wars. The piano wire modification represented a balance between discipline and creativity, between following orders and confronting reality. In the end, the P-38 Lightning earned a formidable reputation in the Pacific. It escorted bombers over vast distances, intercepted enemy aircraft at altitude, and carried some of America's highest-scoring aces. Its story is often told in terms of speed, range, and firepower. But hidden within that history is a quieter truth. 3/8 of an inch of slack once separated intention from action. That slack cost time, and time in aerial combat is measured in survival. A mechanic reduced that gap to zero. No medal marked the moment, no headline announced the change. Yet somewhere over New Guinea, a pilot pulled back on his control stick and felt his aircraft respond without hesitation. He tightened his turn just enough. He lined up his guns just in time. He lived. Sometimes history turns not on grand strategies or sweeping offensives, but on the smallest corrections, made by hands stained with oil, guided by the belief that good enough is not good enough when lives are at stake.